Thank you everyone for joining us today for Lydia's talk, Surveillance States, How AI Reshapes Borders, Recognize and Human Rights. My name is Rachel Tan. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Political Science. Oh, yes. Forgot about Zoom people. Hello, people over Zoom. Yeah, I am a third-year PhD student in the Department of Political Science, and I study, broadly speaking, political economy of AI technologies deployed at borders. And today, before we get started, I wanted to just mention a little bit about this event and its co-sponsors. Today, our event is sponsored by the IRIS National Resource Center, as well as the Pulitzer Center, the Center for European Studies at UW-Madison. And Michaela is going to briefly share with us about the Pulitzer Center.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Michaela Schmidt. I also use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Washington, DC. Really excited to be here today. So for those of you who don't know, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization. We're dedicated to raising awareness of underreported global issues. So our mission is to champion the powers of stories to make issues relevant and inspire action. So with that, we're covering some of the biggest challenges facing the world today, including environment and climate change, public health, peace and conflict, human rights, and of course, AI and technology that we're going to be getting into some today. With this, we support newsrooms and journalists around the world and give them funds to do their own reporting projects on some of these global issues. And last year, we supported around 200 collaborations. We also believe that people in communities who actively engage with systemic challenges will find solutions together. So that's where we come to some of these kind of programs. By combining the journalism with public cultivation, engagement, classroom events, and more, we're extending the impact of the journalism and trying to empower communities to think about how they can be taking actions on these issues. So with that, the Pulitzer Center runs a campus consortium network of about 40 universities across the United States. Wisconsin-Madison is one of them. And with that, we bring a speaker in both the fall and the spring for students to get to engage directly with a journalist who's doing some of this work themselves. And then in addition to that, we also sponsor a student reporting fellow who gets to travel internationally and do their own reporting project with us. So this year, our fellow is going to be Kat Carroll. She's traveling to Austria to report on a revitalized worker nurse migration program. So we're really excited that Kat will be working with our cohort. And yeah, I just wanted to give that little bit of an overview of what the program is. We run this fellowship every year. So it's eligible for students every year to apply and join. And then you get to meet all of the students from all of our other partner universities and get to collaborate with them as well. But I'm going to hand it back over so we can get to our speaker for today.
Okay. So today we are joined with, this event is hosted by the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center. So the IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K through 12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. So Essie Lenchner will be running the Zoom portion of today's hybrid event. For those joining via Zoom, please use the chat to share your comments and questions. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link via a post-event email. Okay, so before we begin our event, we would like to provide a UW-Madison land acknowledgement statement as well. So the University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation has called Dejop since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory. Decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. This history of colonization informs our shared future of collaboration and innovation. Today, UW-Madison respects the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. So today, I would like to introduce everyone to Lydia Emmanouilidou. She is an independent multimedia reporter based in Athens, Greece, and Boston, Massachusetts. Lydia began her journalism career as part of NPR's investigations unit, where she contributed research and reporting to multiple award-winning series. Lydia has also worked as a producer and reporter for NPR member station WGBH in Boston. There, she covered higher education and local news. Most recently, she served as the staff reporter for The World, where she covered technology until she was selected to be the program's foreign correspondent in Athens. In 2021, Lydia has started to report on Lesbos Island refugees, and her work was recognized with the National Edward R. Murrow Award. As a Pulitzer Center AI Accountability Fellow, she's working on stories about border technologies in Europe and the US. So now I'll hand it over to Lydia and for her to take us away.
Thank you everyone for coming, and hello. I am Lydia Emmanouilidou. My pronouns are also she, her. And can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. So just a reminder, I think there's a sign-up sheet going around. If you haven't signed it, please do. So I will be speaking to you today about some of the work I have done with the help of the Pulitzer Center on various technologies used at borders in the EU and also at the US-Mexico border, as well as within refugee camps in Greece, which are funded by the European Union. This is the title of my presentation. And I wanted to tell you a little bit more about me. So I'm a freelance journalist based mostly in Greece at the moment, although I also have a base in Boston. I'm Greek American, so I'm able to easily go back and forth between the two places. And right now I'm a freelance journalist, which means I'm not working for one particular news organization. Rather, I am partnering with various media outlets depending on the story I'm doing. And these are some of the places where you can find my recent work. And of course, I was recently a Pulitzer Center Fellow where I got to work on some of the stories that we'll be talking about today. So first, I wanted to start with a very simple definition of the types of systems that we will be talking about, although we were discussing earlier that when I first started doing this work, it was in around 2022, 2023, so pre-ChatGPT days. So it felt like people really needed a definition. You're probably all aware at this point of what AI is and how we interact with it on a day-to-day basis. But just in case, this is one of the best and simplest definitions I have been able to find. AI systems are created by humans to make their own automated decisions based on a set of rules. So for example, even a facial recognition system is making a decision about whether face X, say on a passport or a document, matches face Y being projected on a camera screen, and so on. And today, again, we'll be talking about various border technologies being used at the US-Mexico border, as well as EU borders and within refugee camps in Greece. And I want to emphasize here something really important, that although I think if you've ever traveled internationally or even domestically recently, you have probably had to interact with some AI systems, primarily facial recognition cameras, when you're going through customs or even boarding a plane. Today, we'll be talking about technology that is used on people who are in a forced migration situation. So people who have been, for one reason or another, been forced to flee their home countries because they're fleeing war, they're fleeing persecution, and are increasingly subjected to AI and other automated technologies at borders and when they go through the asylum procedure. So we'll be talking about people who are coming either to the US or to the EU, primarily to lodge asylum claims for international protection, which they have the right to do under international law, and how they're encountering technologies both at borders as well as throughout the asylum process. In the case of the US, as you know, we are speaking about people primarily coming from South and Central America, but other places as well. And some of the examples of the AI that we have seen at borders, and I'm speaking now about both the US-Mexico border and various borders in the EU, include robot dogs, drones, facial recognition cameras, and other biometric devices. We have a variety of surveillance towers being deployed at various borders that I have reported on, and then once people pass through a border and have interacted with these technologies, we are also seeing AI popping up in spaces like refugee camps and also incorporated into the asylum process. So for example, in Europe, we have had systems including speech recognition systems being piloted. So this would be a system that determines if a person's accent is indeed from the place that they claim to be, to assess whether they're telling the truth about where they're from. We have also seen technology like emotional recognition being used and being piloted in the EU, and being used to assess based on how people are expressing their emotions, whether they're telling the truth or not about their backstory, where they're coming from, what they're fleeing, and so on. So first, I want to talk briefly about the work I have done at the US-Mexico border, and I really was debating whether to even get into this section of my work, because most of my field work was done around 2023. And so in some ways, it was under the previous Biden administration, and in some ways the situation has changed drastically at the border. But in other ways, it has not. So one thing I want to stress is that the investment in technologies at the US-Mexico border have been consistently made under both Democratic and Republican administrations post 9/11. So even during the Biden administration, we saw a big investment in technologies at the US border. And this is a map that the Electronic Frontier Foundation put together of all the towers at the various types of surveillance towers spanning the whole US-Mexico border. And I would highly encourage you, if you're interested in finding out more, to go on their website. They've done a really good job mapping this. Where I have done my field work is at the Arizona-Mexico border specifically, which is seen as a bit of a testing ground. When you look at the US-Mexico border, there are technologies that are being piloted there that are then rolled out on a wider basis. And one of the main types of technologies that we see are these surveillance towers made by the Israeli company Elbit Systems. There are more than 50 of these along the Arizona-Mexico border alone, and they're equipped with all sorts of technologies, including infrared cameras, radar sensors that authorities can monitor from control rooms remotely. And then in the desert, there are sensors, there are drones that are deployed, there are mobile surveillance towers that border agents are able to basically move around different regions as they're needed. And these are some of the things that people who are crossing irregularly encounter or can encounter in their journeys if they're not going through regular ports of entry, although even in those cases, there's all sorts of technology that you're interacting with. So when you talk to officials about why they are increasingly relying on border technology, and by the way, there have been, at the Arizona-Mexico border alone, there have been billions invested over the past decade in these technologies. And when you ask US authorities, as I did, I went to the Customs and Border Protection headquarters in Tucson, and I got a tour and I got a presentation from CBP about the types of technology they're using and why. And they have a number of reasons why they say they're increasingly relying on these systems. One of them, of course, is that these systems can help agents monitor border crossings and crack down on illegal activity like trafficking, human trafficking and drug smuggling. And they also present these technologies as a more humane approach to physical border barriers like walls. And a more effective approach. I mean, if you've been to parts of the US-Mexico border as I have, despite this a massive wall that I think we've all heard a lot about in the news, there's sections of the wall that are literally open and people can pass through. So authorities see this as a complementary approach to the physical border barriers and a more humane approach. And importantly, they stress that these technologies can be used to find people who are in distress, who might be in the desert, the Sonora Desert, and stuck, in the middle of an area that is not being patrolled. And authorities have stressed to me and to other journalists that this is one of the key reasons why tech is so important, is because they can deploy it in areas that are hard to reach and provide, crucial, whatever is needed to somebody who might be in distress. And I think in theory, a lot of these justifications make sense. But in reality, things are quite different. So this is, it's a bit blurry, the picture, but the person you're seeing here on the foreground of the photo is a researcher named Sam Chambers, and he's a professor at the University of Arizona, who for the past few years has been trying to understand the impact of surveillance technologies on people on the move at the Arizona-Mexico border in particular. And to put it as simply as I can, what he has found is that actually this technology is deadly for people on the move. And that's because people will take, when they become aware of surveillance towers, of sensors, of any kind of technology that is deployed to deter them from entering the US, to prevent them from entering the US, they will take much more dangerous and much longer routes. This won't stop them from coming, but instead they will go through much more difficult terrain, through longer routes in order to reach their destination and apply for asylum. So this kind of work that Chambers and other researchers have been doing, I mention him because he's a bit of a pioneer in this area, in my opinion. He has been able to show with data that he gets from the county's coroner's office that these technologies can again force people to take more dangerous routes and force people to and lead to more deaths. So these findings and others by researchers, I think, contradict very much this narrative by US authorities that this technology is crucial to saving lives. And importantly, if you ask, as I have, if you ask US authorities to kind of quantify what some of the other claims they make, like, okay, how effective is this technology? How is it more effective than physical barriers? How many arrests? How many drug traffickers have you been able to catch, for example? They will say, actually, it's really, really hard to quantify this. So we can't give you data on how it's more effective, but it is. Which for me as a journalist is not particularly compelling. And another thing that I was looking at in the US when I was doing my field research is the impact on humanitarian workers and on locals. And for both of these groups, there are people who are impacted on a day-to-day basis. So I spoke to locals who are living very close to the border. So in Arivaca, Arizona, for example, which is just a stone throws away from the Mexico border. And they are living literally under the eye of these towers. And many of them actually take part in humanitarian efforts. They will do things like leave bags for potential border crossers in the desert, bags with water and first aid kits and things like this. And they feel, one, that they're being watched, and also that, you know, they're not doing anything illegal by engaging in this work, but it does create a chilling effect when, you know, I spoke to a search and rescuer who actually goes into the desert on his own. He has his own team of people who go into the desert and search for people who might be in distress. And they have had situations where they've tripped sensors on the ground and suddenly agents show up out of nowhere near them, or there's a drone flying overhead and monitoring them. And so again, they're not doing anything illegal, but it creates this chilling effect where you feel like you might be doing something wrong and you might get in trouble for it. And you could. I wanted to bring up one other thing about the US context and how how AI has been introduced in the asylum procedure itself. This has changed slightly, but I'll get into it. So this is not an article that I did, but I think it's really important to point this out, that there was a time when the Biden administration had rolled out this CBP One app, where people who were coming to the US to apply for asylum were being asked or were required to sign up for interviews through this application. And one thing that started to emerge is that people of color, Black people and brown people, were having a really hard time even logging into the app, which used facial recognition. And this is because of a problem that I think many of us are aware of. You may have heard about AI being racist, and this is because AI systems tend to be trained on data and that is really bad at recognizing basically anyone other than white men. This is starting to change a bit, but it has led to some real life consequences for people. Like we've had here in the US, false arrests of people because of a false positive using facial recognition technology. And there are stories that you can look up and read for yourself. So, you know, this gives you a sense of how these systems can embed some of the biases that already exist in society and sort of supercharge them. Now, this app is no longer used because the Trump administration eliminated it shortly after they came into office. There's another version of it that's being used, but this doesn't mean that the technology is not a central part of the Trump administration's approach. And now we're seeing, you know, in addition to the rhetoric and the very powerful imagery that's coming from the Trump administration about what will happen to people if they cross irregularly, we have seen, if you follow the news, these photos of these mega prisons in El Salvador where people are being deported, right? There's a power to these images that is clearly deterring people from coming, because we have seen a drop in the number of people who are showing up at the US-Mexico border. But there are other tools that the Trump administration is relying on in its immigration crackdown, including, for example, risk assessment algorithms, surveillance, various technologies to identify undocumented migrants. A huge thing that we're increasingly hearing about is social media monitoring tools that are being used. And so, you know, even though things have changed a bit since I was last in the field, they are bound to, you know, shift again, depending on which administration is in office. And again, these investments are investments that we have seen being made under both Democratic and Republican administrations. So this is not going to change. Now, I want to shift focus a bit and talk about the work that I have been focused on, again, through the help of the Pulitzer Center over the past few years, and much more closely because I am based in Europe and have been able to, you know, keep up with all the developments and report on the developments that are happening. And so we'll be talking a bit about the AI and surveillance technologies that are used both at borders and at refugee camps, and a little bit of context that I think might be helpful here is that we, again, are talking about people who are coming to apply for international protection and who need to come to be on Greek or EU soil in order to apply for that protection. So I'll give you just a little bit of context for those who haven't been following things as closely there. This is a map of where Greece is right here. And as you might know, Greece is one of 27 EU member states. It's a member of the European Union, but it has this interesting geographic position that has landed it in the middle of various migration crises. I put crises in quotes because that's a debatable term, over the past a decade or so. So Greece is an EU country, but it is surrounded by non-EU countries, including Turkey and various Northern African countries. And even to its north, we have Albania, we have North Macedonia and other countries that are not part of the EU. So this is why Greece is considered a part of the EU's external border. And because of its position, geographical position, we have had people both from the Middle East and from various parts of North Africa and elsewhere coming to Greece by the sea, the Aegean Sea, or through the land border here between Greece and Turkey. And some of them want to stay in Greece and lodge an asylum claim. Many of them want to move on to other European countries like Germany. And we had around 2015, 2016, a huge number of people, nearly 1 million people, many of them Syrians fleeing the Syrian civil war, coming through Greece, landing on the Greek islands, and also other, it was not just Syrians, we also have Afghans, Iraqis, and other people. But this was one of the biggest waves of migration we have seen in recent history into Greece, certainly into the EU. And I think it's important to talk about the initial reception and how that has changed, and also how the policies have changed. So initially, I think many people on the islands in Greece and in Europe were quite welcoming. We had one island that was a quite popular landing point, and many people were ending up there, the island of Lesbos right here, which you might have heard about in headlines. It got a lot of coverage during the 2015-2016 crisis, and people on that island were basically taking time off work to show up on the beaches of Lesbos and welcome people who were arriving. The locals on the island were even nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize because of their warm reception to refugees. And you also had leaders in other EU countries, like the German Chancellor Angela Merkel at the time, saying, we can do this, we can welcome refugees. But as more people kept arriving in Greece and in other southern states, which are not the most economically well-off countries in the EU and are smaller compared to other EU countries, this began to feel like a burden on these countries. And the tide started to shift. Both public perception and policy towards refugees, which was, again, quite open at the beginning. So since 2015, we have seen a number of things happen. There have been a number of developments, including a rise in so-called pushbacks. So this is a practice that the Greek Coast Guard is accused of engaging in, essentially intercepting boats or people trying to come through the land border and sending them back to Turkey, which is an illegal practice. We call those pushbacks. Greece denies doing it, but there's overwhelming evidence that it is happening, including by the New York Times, which captured a pushback from beginning to end. And this practice also happens once people reach the Greek islands or the Greek mainland. There are cases, including the case that, again, the New York Times captured from beginning to end, of people being rounded up, put in unmarked vans, taken to a port, put on rafts, and being left out at sea to go back to Turkey, because Greece no longer wants to deal with this migration problem. We have also seen conditions, really terrible conditions for people who do manage to make it into Greece and the EU. They end up in a number of refugee camps where they wait out their asylum applications. And part of my work is focused on monitoring the conditions for people there, which have, if definitely not improved, and probably worsened in some ways. And overall, I mentioned this because really what we have seen over the last decade or so is a hardening of policies and a lot more securitization, both at the borders and in any kind of migration space, including refugee camps. So one of the things that I have been following in the EU and in Greece in particular is how the border systems that we talked about, the drones, the surveillance towers, the cameras, are being used or not used. And just like in the US, officials in the EU will say that these technologies are critical to search and rescue operations, that again, they can find people who are stranded at sea or in the middle of the forest, in the case of the Greek-Turkey land border, and they can be used to help, track these people down and save them. But what I and colleagues have found consistently is that actually, not only are these systems not being used to find people, but they're actually being used to facilitate pushback operations. So I think one of the best examples of this that I can get into a bit more if we have time at the end, but I'll have to go in surface level, was the Pylos shipwreck incident, which made a lot of international headlines. You may have heard about it. This was the deadliest shipwreck actually in the Greek search and rescue zone in Greece's history. It happened in the summer of 2023 when a boat carrying, we estimate, more than 700 people ended up in distress off the Greek coast. This is an actual picture of the boat captured by a drone by the EU Coast Guard agency, Frontex, which was shared with Greece. And what we found in investigating this incident is that it took many, many hours, despite the Greeks having evidence that this boat was in distress, was overcrowded and unseaworthy. People were begging for help. I mean, you can even see some people waving in this photo. It took many, many hours for the Greek Coast Guard to show up to the scene. And when it did show up, what it did and didn't do in those critical last hours caused the ship to sink, killing about 600 people. So what we were able to piece together with colleagues for The Guardian and for various other outlets, we did a multimedia investigation, is that the Greek Coast Guard basically tried to tow this boat towards Italy so that this would no longer be Greece's problem, it would be Italy's problem. And in the process of doing that, the boat tipped and 600 people drowned. Now, interestingly enough, the Coast Guard vessel that responded, was on scene, had the latest iteration, the latest, best cameras that the Greek Coast Guard has deployed. It was equipped with night vision cameras, and according to agreements that the Coast Guard has signed, it had to be recording this search and rescue operation. But after this incident, when people asked, okay, where's the recording of what happened? Because 600 people died and we need to find out. The Coast Guard said, oh, actually, the cameras were not working that night. So this gives you an idea of how tech is not only, again, not used in the way that European authorities claim for search and rescue, but in the cases where it could provide crucial evidence, it potentially incriminating evidence, the footage and the evidence disappears. So this is an overview of what's happening at the border. And as I mentioned, I'm also looking at the securitization happening within refugee camps. So when people started arriving around 2015, 2016 in really big numbers, what started happening on the Greek islands is we saw these essentially these makeshift tent cities popping up. And people, as you can see, were living in really, really terrible conditions. There was no running water in these camps. There was no medical personnel for people. And there were thousands and thousands of people crammed in spaces intended for a lot fewer than were crammed in there. And people were waiting years on end to go through the asylum procedure. But around 2020, the European Union said, this is not very EU. We don't like how this looks. So we're going to invest in millions, hundreds of millions of euros into a new generation of refugee camps on the Greek islands that are going to be a model for any kind of future venture we do in the EU. And this is what several of these camps look like today. As you can see, they're very different from the previous iteration of the camps. There's turnstiles to enter. They're surrounded by double barbed wire fencing. People need to use their biometrics, including fingerprints, to enter the camps. And there's all sorts of surveillance equipment that is being used inside. And one of the systems that I have been looking at closely is this system called Centaur, which is an automated threat detection system that authorities poured millions and millions of euros into, hoping to make the camp safer, both for the populations in the camp, but also the surrounding communities. And this apparatus includes, again, cameras, drones, sensors throughout the camp. At some point, the authorities were even discussing equipping guards with augmented reality glasses so that if there was an incident, a safety incident, they could deploy people on the scene. But essentially, the point of this system is to automatically detect threats in the camp. So for example, if there is an unauthorized vehicle that shows up, if there's a huge crowd forming somewhere where it shouldn't be, if there's somebody holding something that looks like a weapon in the camp, the system is in theory supposed to flag this and alert authorities locally and in Athens, monitoring everything from a control room remotely. Importantly, actually, I want to mention a bit separately, but importantly, we have also been tracking the practice of data extractions from phones. So when people come to the refugee camps, are registered, many of them report having their phones taken away, and we don't know exactly what happens, but based on our, according to sources that we have spoken to within the camps, there's a lot of data that's being extracted from people's phones, and there's evidence for this, which is also a worrying trend. But back to Centaur and the technologies, the surveillance technologies in the camps. These are some of the issues that I have been addressing in my reporting. I have been trying to understand how compliant, if these technologies and the way they were implemented are compliant with European data protection laws, which, as you might know, are quite stricter and than any laws that exist here in the US. I mean, essentially, there is no federal law, privacy law, the way that we have in Europe. It's called the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. And one of the things I and colleagues who have worked on stories about this were able to find early on is that actually the way these systems were implemented in the refugee camps were completely illegal and in violation of the GDPR, and that Greek authorities and EU authorities that were funding these technologies had this sort of, move fast and break things, Silicon Valley mentality that resulted in people's privacy rights being trampled. We also have looked at issues of transparency, and you might not be surprised to find out that there's not a lot of transparency around these systems, both in terms of how they work, what algorithms are used, how people's data, who the data is shared with, what happens to somebody when they are flagged as a threat, what does this mean for their asylum journey? And also there were big issues with the effectiveness of these technologies. As I mentioned, there were a lot of selling points by authorities about how these systems were going to keep people in the camps safe, and they gave us very specific examples of the types of things that they were supposed to prevent. However, we found many instances of the very things that these systems were supposed to prevent happening again and again in the camps. And then the last thing I've been trying to understand is the impact these systems have on asylum seekers, both from the standpoint of how might this impact their asylum applications later on if they're flagged as a threat, but also what it is like to live under constant surveillance. And the opinions are mixed among asylum seekers. Some of them, in particular, women in my experience that I have spoken to, do like having cameras and other technologies in the camps. It makes them feel safer. But then there are also many people, especially those who come from authoritarian regimes, people who have been monitored by their own governments, who are very uneasy about having cameras everywhere in the camp, in external areas, but also indoors. And it's also important to mention that these investments in technology are not happening in a vacuum. These camps, these so-called flagship model camps, this is what the EU has called them, have had a myriad of issues in their 4 years of existence, including lack of running water, lack of medical services. I pulled just the latest piece of information I could find from Doctors Without Borders, MSF, which is an NGO that provides medical services in the camp. Because there's no state-appointed doctor in any of these camps, an NGO has to go in independently and provide medical support. And they issued this press release a few days ago about how there were cases of malnutrition in one of the camps among children. And so I bring this up just to stress that there are real needs in these camps that are not necessarily being addressed, while at the same time there are millions and millions of euros being poured into technologies at the camps and control rooms, like this control room in Athens that I got to visit and see a couple years ago. And I also wanted to show this from a very recent investigation that I did with colleagues in Greece, with the Greek investigative newsroom Solomon, and some partners in Switzerland with the Swiss magazine. And we looked at the conditions specifically for unaccompanied minors in the camp. And these are children who have been separated from their parents, either during their journey to the EU, or they may have made the journey by themselves to join their family in Europe. And what we found were really dire living conditions these are children. Everyone there is living in this safe zone as a child. We found cases of people, during periods of overcrowding where kids didn't even have a bed, they had to sleep in shifts and share a mattress on the floor. No running water, again, very specific. There are specific hours when there's water available in these camps for people to bathe and even eat, even drink water, not sufficient food. And again, this is to stress that these investments are not happening in a vacuum. These are the very same camps that have all this new tech. And finally, I think we have a little time, and I wanted to both to give you a visual, but also to broaden this out a bit. I wanted to play 5-10 minutes of this documentary that I contributed research and reporting to recently, an Al Jazeera documentary called The Palestine Laboratory, which looks at the big role that Israeli companies play in exporting technologies to various places around the world. The part that I will play you is about the EU camps that I talked about. But if you are interested in learning more, you can stream this for free, I think, online. And there's also a part about the US-Mexico border and how Israeli tech is being used there, which is quite interesting. So if you're okay with it, we can watch, I'd like to watch just a few minutes of this and then I can take questions.
On several pro-Palestine resolutions.
Oops.
The use of Israeli technology is even more profoundly embedded in the European Union. The EU is the second largest buyer of Israeli weapons. Israeli so-called smart fence technology is being installed on Europe's land borders to control migration. And we're here in Samos, Greece, just 2 kilometers from Turkey, to see how Israeli surveillance tech is central to the EU's vision for border security. We're meeting Petra Molnar, who is an anthropologist and a global expert on migration and borders.
Good to see you. Bye. Samos, I think, is a really important place to try and understand because it was one of the first camps that was constructed to deal with a mass influx of people who were escaping the Syrian war back in 2015, 2016.
On the hillside just outside the main town of Vathi, the old camp was built for 650 people, but was rapidly overwhelmed with up to 9,000.
It was a bustling city within a city, almost kind of spilling down the hillside like a glass of milk into the city of Vathi there.
People had to build their own ramshackle tents, and there were reports of rape and violence.
I mean, obviously the conditions were horrific, but it had a bit of like a community feeling to it. People were surviving. There was a school. People would cook and spend time together. As we kept getting more and more people on the island, the authorities decided that something had to be done to this camp.
And therefore they obviously decided they want to build something more high-tech and bigger.
Yeah, that's right, with money from the European Union. And Samos was the first camp like this that was constructed. It's just over the hill there. And it is very, very different from this one.
In 2021, thousands of refugees were moved to the new Closed Control Access Centre, or CCAC.
Much better living conditions, but at the same time increase security provisions for the benefit of asylum seekers, of the benefit of the staff, and of the benefit of the local communities.
This CCAC is up a hill, 8 kilometres from the town.
What really strikes you first, like it's a massive block of concrete. It's sun-baked, it's so hot. It's just, you know, there's very little vegetation inside the camp and also so much surveillance. When we went in for the official opening, we were able to go inside the containers where people are living and there are cameras in the corridors. There's also cameras on some of the taller poles. People have reported drone usage and where the data is going and who it's being shared with is not exactly clear.
So what is it like to live there? Ruli came from Syria and was moved from the old camp to the CCAC.
You see the wires, the cameras, the security guards, the police, like, where am I? I'm in Guantanamo now. Sometimes I was exiting my container to take a fresh air. Like I cannot be in this box. You look here, like there is a camera. You look there, like there is a camera. You turn like this, there is a camera. And then beside that, like everywhere there are police officer, security guard. You're controlled. Your life is under control 24/7. You feel like everyone like is staring at you. Like as you are like the most dangerous person in the world.
I want to know what all this surveillance is for, so I'm meeting an NGO that provides legal support to asylum seekers.
When people are registered in the Closed Control Access Centre, they're required to give their fingerprints multiple times. And part of this is for the asylum procedure. It's for the Eurodac system. That's an EU-wide database of fingerprints of asylum seekers. but it's also for Epirion, this biometric AI technology that the CCAC has in place that's 100% funded by the EU. So they have a biometric card, and when they leave the facility and when they come back in, they have to scan the card and scan their fingerprint to be able to enter and exit. When you look at the Ministry of Migration's website, you can see that they report that there's behavioral or motion recognition analytics that is being used in the Centauro system. To our understanding, it's that there's CCTV cameras and drones, which are then live streamed to a control center in Athens.
This is known as Centaur and controls the Samos CCAC and 4 other similar camps. At the heart of it is a system supplied by Octopus, an Israeli firm whose customers include the Israeli military.
Octopus allows simple management of entire security events from one screen.
And on Samos, we discovered that the behavioral analytics is done by Israeli company Visites, which is supported by the Israeli army and intelligence services.
It goes to these policies of exclusion and technologies of control. I mean, I was in the occupied West Bank last year, and some of the infrastructure that you see there is replicated here. I mean, it is the kind of same thinking that technology can be used to manage people and control people and keep people away that you don't want on your territory.
Key to Europe's efforts to keep people away are the Heron drones Israel uses to surveil Gaza. In 2020, Israel aerospace industry signed a $50 million deal to provide the drones to the EU's border force, Frontex.
Introducing Heron Maritime UAS with a multi-sensor payload tailored to the mission and with 24 hours of endurance.
Known as a fixed-wing drone, the Heron has a range of up to 1,000 kilometers from its base in Malta. Unlike a ship on the sea, a drone has no obligation to rescue vessels in distress. Instead, Frontex passes the location of migrant boats to the Libyan Coast Guard.
The boat capsized during the interception.
The EU pays Libya to intercept migrants, and in just the first 10 months of 2024, over 18,000 people were stopped from reaching Europe.
There's people in the water now.
Yeah.
A lot of people in the water, all of them.
Everybody.
At least 28,000 people have died in the Mediterranean in the last decade.
The Greek government and the EU deny that they do pushbacks. What do you think their logic is in doing so?
They want to make the passage into the EU as difficult and as violent as possible so that other people are dissuaded from coming. Because the more technology you have, the bigger your surveillance dragnet is. And people also know that, and so they will take riskier routes to try and avoid that surveillance.
In 2019, the Greek Coast Guard signed a deal with Israeli company Elbit for a full combat suite, enabling patrol boats to control fleets of drones and conduct surveillance far beyond the line of sight. The army acquired an Israeli-made Heron drone for border duty in 2020, and the Coast Guard has had one since 2022. This footage shows the Coast Guard illegally pushing a boat out of Greek waters and into Turkish waters, known as a pushback. It's something Woolley experienced multiple times during his attempts to reach Greece.
They were like hitting us with the iron metal, and they were like destroying the motor and asked us like to throw the oil, the benzene of the motor. That's to not be able to cross after when they leave.
Main contact with someone who works at this.
So I will stop this here. I think you get the idea, and hopefully it gives you a helpful visual of all of the things that we have been discussing. And I will end with just a couple of thoughts that I can do this. I will end with a few guiding questions that I use when I am investigating an AI system or surveillance system, whether it is in the US or the EU. You can see these questions here. Is the system legal? Is it proportional? Is it addressing an issue that needs to be addressed? In the case of Greece and the refugee camps, I would say provably no. The Greek Data Protection Authority found that the way that Greece implemented the systems was not legal, and neither was it proportional. How much does it cost and who profits? There are a few tech companies that are both Israeli companies, US companies, European companies, Greek companies that are profiting consistently from these projects and tend to get the government contracts. Could this reinforce biases and inequalities, like in the case of facial recognition? And what is the impact on human rights? And then finally, how would we feel about this technology being deployed on a mass scale? Because many of these technologies that are being piloted on more vulnerable populations like asylum seekers, the intention of the companies deploying them is to implement them on a much wider scale. For example, the companies involved in the refugee camp tech projects in Greece, we know from reporting that they have ambitions to roll out their technology in commercial settings, including supermarkets and gas stations and all sorts of other places. So I will end here. I will take any questions now or after the event if you guys are able to stick around. And please, if you can take this survey, it would help us a lot at the Pulitzer Center to hear your feedback.
Two things. Thanks for your talk. No mention of genetic testing. There's a company with operations here in Boston, Thermo Fisher, does border stuff.
Yeah.
Would encourage you to look into that.
Yeah.
Second, has anybody mapped the legal authority and budget activity that support these initiatives back to the people who, the elected officials who voted for them?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Has anybody mapped
the legislative authority and the budget authority of the practices in place back to the politicians who voted for them?
No, I'm not aware of somebody having mapped that out, but we have, at least in Greece, made connections between the companies that are contracted to carry out to do these projects with various politicians running the migration ministry, for example, or various ministries like in civil protection. It's, you know, there's somebody's wife's sister's cousin's brother.
Totally, but it's interesting when you find out who actually voted for the stuff, because I've seen it here in the States. You know, it's not just Republicans, it's often
exactly,
you know, Mark Warner, for example.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's sort of amazing.
Yeah.
But it would be a good exercise to do that.
Yeah, sure.
Share from Mike. And he says, isn't it becoming increasingly standard procedure for immigration authorities everywhere to restrict content and cell phones?
Sure, yes. And we're seeing that also happening, or hearing stories of this happening increasingly in the US, people who are non-citizens in particular trying to enter the US, and there have been many reports of people's phones being seized, data being extracted. And as I mentioned, this is we're seeing this being done also on a whole other level to asylum seekers who are landing in Greece, either the people who are ending up in refugee camps or just going through the initial interviews with authorities or having their phones taken away and all sorts of data extracted from their phones. It's not a practice that I think is necessarily good to normalize. You know, often the argument is, oh, I have nothing to hide, let the authorities take my phone away and look through everything. To me, that's not a very compelling argument, and it's not something that we should just accept as standard procedure. It violates people's privacy and human rights.
So I'm new to this field and naive. So, but if you, from your experience, if you were in a position of responsibility for these camps, what would you do specifically? What would you censor? What would you do to maintain safety? One or two examples of what you would do from your experience to make them safe to,
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would provide people with basic necessities like water and food, so that there isn't this climate of, there isn't the tension that there tends to be in these camps, especially for the unaccompanied minors that I mentioned. Greek authorities are constantly talking to me about cases of vandalism and violence in these spaces, but when you talk to the people who work directly with the kids, they'll say, well, they're locked in this space without adequate food, without any activities, without any schooling for months at a time in some cases, even though they're not supposed to be. They're literally not allowed to leave this camp within the camp. And so they have nothing else to do. They have nowhere else to take out their energy other than smashing windows. To me, I would probably, frankly, do the same if I was in their situation and locked in a space for months at a time. So to me, there are some immediate and basic needs that need to be addressed that would create a safer environment for both the people living there and for the people working there, and therefore for the surrounding communities.
Thanks so much, Lydia, for your talk.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, do we know anything about how such data is used in refugee asylum processes, or like whether border officials are trained, or if they are trained, how are they trained to interpret like whatever analytics is produced out of these technologies?
Yeah, this is a big question that I wish I knew I could have a really good answer to. We know that, for example, in Greece, or we have indications that data extracted from cell phones is used in the asylum process. Certainly in countries like Germany, they're pretty open about the fact that they can extract, when you go there and you apply for asylum, they can extract data from your phone that they use to verify certain parts of your interview and statements. So data that people might not even be aware they have on their phone might be used against them. Or in a lot of cases, we know that people don't have one single cell phone or one single SIM card throughout their journey. You know, these things swap hands. And so there's all this data that, again, people might not be aware of that is being used. And within the refugee camp context, this is one of the questions I'm still trying to answer, is how all of the surveillance data that's being collected on people and these threat indicators, if and how they're used in other parts of the asylum process, and if they're shared with other EU authorities who are then able to see, oh, this person was flagged as a threat in this Greek refugee camp, and is this going to follow them around? And not surprisingly, the Greeks and EU authorities are not very forthcoming about this. So we have had to do things like we were speaking about earlier, apply for do FOIAs, Freedom of Information requests, try to find whistleblowers, speak to people who are working in the camps to try to understand the extent of the sharing. Yeah.
Another question from Zoom. Mike is wondering, how have the changes in Syria affected refugees, and has there been an influx of additional refugees since that change? The Assad regime put in place?
Sure. So there has not been an influx of refugees. If anything, there have been people who have expressed wanting to go back to Syria after the fall of the Assad regime. And I'm speaking specifically about people who I've talked to in Greece, Syrians who are in Greece at the moment. One thing that has happened across the EU is in many EU countries is that asylum applications for Syrians have been put on pause. So if you were going through the asylum procedure, even if you have done your interview, whatever it might be, or if you're waiting, you have an interview date scheduled that you've been waiting for months or years, suddenly all that's put on pause because the EU, various EU authorities are saying we need to assess the situation and find out how this change in regime is impacting, would impact your application. And the authorities will argue that this is being done to the benefit of the asylum seekers, but a lot of, people, both Syrians that I've spoken to and also, advocates for them, lawyers, think this actually puts people in a situation of limbo where they won't, you're kind of kicking the ball down the road and seeing what will change. So we'll see what happens long term, but this has been the arrangement short term.
Do you have any other questions from the room? We're going to pass the hour, so really appreciate those of you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for going over.
not, I think we can wrap up. And we would like to thank Lydia for joining us today and sharing with us your field experiences with reporting on the ground. As well as thank you all for joining us today. And yes, and the Pulitzer Center and co-sponsors as well, of course. Thank you.